Collecting sure is an expensive hobby, isn't it? Let's talk about it. Hello there, welcome back to the channel. I am Grand Moff Tony, and this week we're doing something a little bit different. We're talking about a subject that I feel is kind of important to discuss because it's relevant whether you're new to the hobby or you've been in the game for a while. And we're talking about a question that comes up quite a lot, I feel. And that is this: why is it that some figures retain their value in the aftermarket, other figures lose their value, and some figures, just a few, really spike in value once they hit that aftermarket? Or to put it another way, what determines the aftermarket value of a Black Series figure? Now, I should preface this by saying I'm not an economist. I don't study marketing. I didn't work at a toy company or anything like that. I am just one well-intentioned idiot who has been in this game for a while and has fun noticing patterns and seeing if they bear any relevance. So I wanted to talk today about a few factors that I've noticed over my time collecting this line that I feel like have an impact on where a figure ends up on the aftermarket in terms of their value. I'll try my best to include some real-world examples as I go along rambling, as well as some examples that maybe disprove what I'm saying along the way. I think we can all appreciate that as time has gone on, this hobby has gotten increasingly expensive. I mean, price hikes are a real thing, they are going on. The price of a Black Series figure has gone up at retail over the last couple of years, but that's not really what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today is specifically the aftermarket. So let's get into it. So the first things I wanted to talk about were manufacturing factors. Things that Hasbro does when they produce the figure that have an effect either first-hand or second-hand on the aftermarket value of a Black Series figure. And the most obvious factor of this is, how was the figure released? Is it a normal, general line release, or is it an exclusive? Normal releases typically either retain their value or lose their value on the aftermarket. The average figure that you see hanging on a shelf in Target or Walmart, typically if you wait a few months, the value of that figure will drop, either because it's been overproduced, see Lando, any Lando, or just because it is a generally established principle of this hobby that the items we're collecting depreciate in value after their initial run in stores. A good example of this you could look at would be the Red Line, which typically, if you look at the aftermarket value according to Action Figure 411, most general release Red Line figures have depreciated in value since leaving stores. You can see examples of this in figures like Rey and Dio, DJ from The Last Jedi. They've roughly retained their aftermarket value, whereas a figure like the First Order Flame Trooper has dropped by about $12 on average. And typically, contrary to this, you have exclusive releases, whether they released to conventions or whether they came specifically to outlet stores like Walmart exclusives and Target exclusives. These figures typically retain their value on the aftermarket if they don't increase in price. I think we're all familiar with the Amazon exclusive Emperor Palpatine, which is one of the most expensive figures on the aftermarket, with other examples including the Clone Commander Obi-Wan from Walgreens, which has gained about $40 in value, or GameStop's Clone Commander Fox, which has also increased in value on the aftermarket. Now, of course, this is manufactured value. These figures were designed and distributed with the idea that they would be difficult to get hold of. After all, if you have to actually travel to a Walmart, which let's face it, you would, because how difficult is it to order Walmart exclusives online? The idea is it creates scarcity in the line. This figure was only released in one place. It was only released at a convention that you had to go to. I have always wanted the San Diego Comic-Con exclusive Grand Admiral Thrawn, but let's face it, I got to the game a little late. I'm never gonna get it. I've accepted that. And that is because exclusive figures typically increase in value in the aftermarket. So what does that tell you? That tells you that if you're at a convention and you want that exclusive figure, you should most likely pick it up at the time, because if you change your mind 2-3 years down the line, it's going to be really hard to get a hold of. On the subject of exclusives, and this kind of ties into my next point, I feel like there is definitely a difference between something like a Walmart exclusive and something like a Target exclusive. Walmart exclusives typically increase in value on the aftermarket, whereas Target exclusives have a tendency to decrease in value. And this ties in very clearly to my next point, which is how well was the release handled? Target, I feel like, are on top of their exclusives. If they have an exclusive, you will most likely find it in a store. The most recent example would be the Andor exclusives with the Ferrix Imperial Officer. Well, he's all over shelves right now. You can pick him up whenever you like. On the opposite end of the scale, you have Walmart, who are famous for being terrible at how they handle their exclusives. The Clone Wars exclusive Walmart wave was a disaster. It disappeared off the internet to a cascade of people saying, I bought 20, they'll be on eBay by the end of the day for 4 times the price. We all see it coming, and that's why we lament the words Walmart exclusive whenever Yakface posts a new release. So a factor that you really do have to look at with figures is how well the release is handled. Did the wave make it to shelves? Target kind of strikes an even balance here because I remember the days of the Target exclusive Clone Wars wave, which was a lot of fun to go out and hunt for because sometimes you actually could find it. Whereas by contrast, the Walmart exclusive Clone Wars wave, I never saw sight nor sound of it on a Walmart shelf. And you can see this reflected in the aftermarket value of these Clone Wars waves. But typically, exclusives on the aftermarket will either retain or increase their value. You can see this reflected in both Clone Wars waves. The Walmart waves, they usually range between an extra $12 to an extra $25, and those Target exclusive Clone Wars figures are all in the plus 20s here and there. Another manufacturing factor that we can look at is how waves are structured. Now, typically, a Black Series wave will be made up of a couple of new releases and a couple of re-releases or reuses or retools. A good example of this would be Wave 26, the first Galaxy line wave, which featured a brand new Darth Vader, a Teebo, an Admiral Akbar, and a Beskar Mandalorian, as well as a repainted Clone Trooper, a re-released Snowspeeder Luke, and doubled up Stormtroopers. So which figures in this wave have retained value or gained value, and which figures have lost value? The new figures of the line, across the board, have gained in value, with the unique sculpt for Teebo, the universally appreciated Darth Vader sculpt, and the Beskar Mandalorian all increasing their value by about $10. The only real exception being Akbar, who has actually depreciated. But what about the rest of the line? Interestingly enough, the repaint of the Clone Trooper and the doubled up Stormtroopers of this wave have all increased in aftermarket value. Now, what might we ascertain from that information? Now, the Imperial Stormtrooper is a pretty desirable figure. I'm pretty sure it's generally agreed across the line that the 2020 Stormtrooper is one of the best molds out there. So it's a very desirable figure, which we'll get into later. The Clone Troopers as well. Clone Trooper repaints are incredibly popular. So it's no surprise that these two figures found value on the aftermarket. But what about that Luke Skywalker? His value has stayed about the same. It may have gone up by a couple of cents or a couple of dollars, but for the most part, it is the same. And that ties into an idea that I'm going to get into in just a second. But how waves are structured, which figures we're seeing for the first time, and which ones we're seeing for the second or third time, is a very good way to gauge what their value will look like on the aftermarket. Let me give you an example from the red line. I'm going to give you a few red line figures and see if you can tell what they all have in common. You have Qui-Gon, Chopper, Ezra, Grand Admiral Thrawn, Jango Fett, Darth Revan, and the red line Obi-Wan. What do all these figures have in common? These are all figures that we saw in the red line and we saw again later on down the line, whether they were re-released as anniversary exclusives like the Qui-Gon or the Obi-Wan, whether they found a Galaxy line photoreal update like the members of the Ghost Crew, or whether they found their way into the archive line like Thrawn or Darth Revan. And this is an interesting point because even though these re-releases made these figures readily readily available at retail once again, in spite of how valuable the originals had already become, the originals still retain that value. And I think that plays into the inbox collectors that we see in our community. Obviously, if you're an inbox completionist, it doesn't matter if a figure is re-released later on down the line, you still need that original figure. If, like me, you relish busting these boxes open and getting the figures out, it doesn't really matter to me whether I'm buying the Return of the Jedi exclusive anniversary Boba Fett or whether I picked up the original Galaxy line Return of the Jedi Boba Fett. It makes no difference. So what we're able to ascertain from this is that re-releases do increase the availability of these figures, but they also increase the value of the originals. Nearly every figure that you look at that has been re-released in some wave or another, if you take a look back at the original, all of those originals have increased in value, and you see that most prominently in the original Black Series lines, the blue lines, the orange lines. They have all increased in value, I would argue, due to the fact that all of these figures have been re-released, made more available, and that has subsequently increased the value of the originals. And this really plays into my final point on manufacturing factors, and that is that a main question that you can ask yourself when a wave is revealed is, how many times have we seen this character before? I mentioned earlier that Luke Skywalker has more or less retained his value in his Snowspeeder look. That's because we've seen Snowspeeder Luke / X-Wing Luke so many times in the line. He's basically diluted his own value. And you could extend that to talk about most Luke Skywalker figures. We've seen Luke Skywalker in the line so many times that anytime a new Luke is revealed, you can usually wait on it because his value is going to stay about the same. Contrast this against three of the most valuable figures in the red line: Dr. Aphra, 000, and BT-1. These characters, at the time that they were released, and at least up until recently, had only appeared in the line once. They appeared in the red line, and that was that. And as a result, their price skyrocketed on the aftermarket. Now, Aphra has, of course, been re-released since then, but have you paid close attention to what's happened to Aphra's value since then? The original may have lost a tiny bit of value, but this new one has spiked exponentially on the aftermarket. Of course, I'm talking about if you're patrolling through eBay, not if you're going direct to the source, which you should always do if possible. These are three incredibly obscure characters that really only those of us who have read the comics are really going to care about. So it's difficult to make the argument that their value is justified by their popularity. No, their value is justified by their rarity. This is the only time we've seen 000 and BT-1 in the Black Series, so of course their value is going to increase. And I feel like the knock-on effect on Dr. Aphra's value since her re-release has to do with the fact that we are clamoring for a shot at this figure, and the people who are selling it on the aftermarket recognize that it is a much desired figure that people have wanted a shot at for a long time. Now, we've touched on this idea of the popularity of a character affecting their aftermarket value, and the most obvious example of this is Boba Fett. Boba Fett always sells. You kind of have to make the decision as to whether you're going to buy a new Boba Fett figure more or less the day that you see it, or the day that it comes out. You have to decide whether this is one that you want or not. The Boba Fett tax is a real thing, regardless of the rationality behind it or the explanation that you receive as to why it's a thing. The fact of the matter is that they will always charge more for Boba Fett, and he will always sell, because he's an incredibly popular character. Even that solid black comic book Boba Fett that everyone was complaining about sold out in a heartbeat and is incredibly difficult to come by. So what's something else that can increase the aftermarket value of a figure? Well, that's discontinuation. If a figure stops being produced for any reason, it's going to grow in value. That's just sensible. The most obvious example of this that I can think of are the three big ones that have gone recently: Clone Captain Rex, Bad Batch Hunter, and Bad Batch Crosshair. Three figures that are incredibly high value on the aftermarket as a direct result of being discontinued. The simple fact of the matter is, discontinuing a figure creates scarcity. It creates a limit to the number of these figures that are out there, and that increases value. If you're holding off on a figure and you find out it's on the chopping block to be discontinued, it's probably best to just bite the bullet and get it now, because 6 months down the line, it'll cost you a refinance on your mortgage to get a hold of. Another majorly consumer-based factor that does affect aftermarket value is relevancy. What is dominating the conversation in the community? Which figures are we talking about? Which figures do we want? Which figures are we really getting into? And even outside of this, extending it to the media, what are the fan base talking about? Is it the new season of The Mandalorian? Is it the latest season of The Bad Batch? Which properties in Star Wars are dominating the conversation? This is definitely something that Hasbro tries to get ahead of and tries to keep up to date with by sort of preemptively stocking lines with new media content, whether it's Mandalorian, Bad Batch, Andor, whatever it is. Whatever is new in Star Wars will always find its way onto the shelves. You just have to look at the Mandalorian line to really see the examples of this. The Galaxy line is still relatively young, and yet the Mandalorian section of that wave has just grown exponentially. I believe it's in the 30s. If that doesn't say trying to stay ahead of the curve with new media, I don't know what does. And obviously, we more or less know that this is part of the licensing deal that Hasbro has with Lucasfilm, which is, in order to retain the license, you have to produce an X amount of new media figures. And you can see this going a couple of ways, because new media figures typically are very, very easy to get a hold of because they are so overproduced. And yet there are a few of them that are very, very difficult to find. And this ties back into ideas of how these figures are released. There's typically an idea that if a new media figure is a general release, it's going to be very easy to find and it's going to depreciate in value very quickly. Take a look at the Andor Shore Troopers that find their way into Targets, or the Death Watch Mandalorian, which, in spite of being one of the best figures on the market, is still pretty easily available in stores. In fact, the only time you really see new release figures either holding on to their value or increasing in value is when they haven't really been released yet. Take a look at the wave of Andor figures that were revealed at PulseCon last year. You had Mon Mothma, Luthen Rail, Bix Kayleen, all of those figures. Now, they haven't even hit shelves yet, and yet obviously, because some people are able to pick them up in certain parts of the world, they've almost found their way onto the aftermarket before they've even been on the primary market. Luthen's figure averages nearly $50 on the aftermarket when he hasn't even come to stores yet. And this really ties into my last point, which I will get to after this next one. And that's this. It's difficult to talk about the conversation in the community without addressing the elephant in the room, which is controversy. Controversy sells. It doesn't just sell, it really sells. As soon as there is some drama or scandal within Star Wars, within the filmmaking process, within marketing, just anything that happens in the fan base that causes a lot of controversy, it always translates into higher prices. The most obvious example of this is the Cara Dune scandal and the Slave Leia scandal. Without getting too much into where I stand on these controversies, Gina Carano obviously let go from The Mandalorian due to some questionable comments online, and the never-ending Slave Leia topic that comes up at least once every 5 years as to whether it's appropriate to market this kind of sexualized slavery to children. These controversies are very hot-button issues. You're gonna see them come up and you know immediately it's gonna cause issues within the collecting community. When Gina was let go from Lucasfilm, the value of that Cara Dune figure skyrocketed. And the Slave Leia figure is one that we've seen once in the line, and there is a general consensus that we will most likely never see it again, which leads to not only an increase in value, but an increase of people giving into that value. Because we say to ourselves, they're never going to re-release this figure, it is only going to get more valuable, I should buy it now before next week it goes up another $10. You can see this in the Solo movie and the line that came out surrounding that. The Solo movie, in spite of what the fanbase would like you to believe today, was panned, largely due to a reactionary response to The Last Jedi coming out a few months beforehand. The community was still divided, people were very angry, and they took it out on this movie. Now, several years later, people have changed their minds. They've done a complete U-turn and decided, actually, we love this movie, why did it never get a sequel? No, don't look at the reviews, no, just make another one. And this kind of renaissance for the prequels and the Solo movie, movies that weren't really received well when they came out, it causes an increase in value in their figures in a very retrospective way. A question that you see a lot online is, why aren't there more prequel figures in the Black Series? And it does have to boil down to the fact that the people who are making the decisions, they remember what happened back in the 1999s and the early 2000s. They remember the response to the prequel movies, and they remember just aisles upon aisles of those Revenge of the Sith packaging figures that sat there for years while toy stores died around them. So just because the fan base changes its mind a few years later and decides, actually, we like these movies now, can we please have some action figures, it's still going to take a while for executives to feel confident enough in the change that they're actually going to put money into producing figures for it. And this really ties into the subject of unwanted figures. The figures that, when they're announced, the community groans and says, who asked for this? I'm talking, of course, about the holiday repaints or the endless Boba Fett repaints. The figures that make the community go, oh, who asked for this? Well, apparently somebody asked for it, because when these figures hit shelves, they are suddenly incredibly difficult to get a hold of. I remember the holiday line hitting shelves and not being able to find that Imperial Stormtrooper for over a year without shelling out a massive amount of money for it. This is a very different kind of controversy, and it results in a very different kind of value increase. Sometimes these figures gain a lot of value through their notoriety, and sometimes they don't. There's really no accounting for it. Black Chrysanthemum was one of the most panned releases in the Black Series history. That figure was revealed, and the fan base almost universally threw up into their mouths, even though when I got it in hand, I actually really liked it. But look at how it affected the value of the figure on the aftermarket. It has remained more or less where it started. It hasn't really gained value, it hasn't really lost value. So there's no accounting for it, really. Controversy will sometimes cause a spike in value if it leads to something like Cara Dune's figures, which obviously we're never going to see in the line again, so those figures are going to increase in value. But when it comes to something like Black Chrysanthemum, who was more or less released with a little tagline that said, we were working on this before Book of Boba Fett, don't worry, there's another one coming. So it has more or less stayed where it started. And this really leads me into my final point, what I perceive to be the biggest factor that plays into where a figure lands on the aftermarket. And that's us. That's us as consumers. It's what we are prepared to pay for a figure. There's no point sitting here for a 10-15 minute video rambling on and complaining about scalpers when scalpers only exist because we feed them. People only put these figures up for these prices because they know that someone out there is going to buy it. Someone is going to pay this price. I look back at figures that I have overpaid for, and I know that I am responsible for the reason that figure maintains that price. I'm responsible because I caved and I paid for it. Value on the aftermarket is really dictated by what people have already paid, by what they have proven themselves to be willing to pay for a figure. Scalpers suck in every hobby. They really do. If you just go out and you buy up this stuff just because you know it's going to spike in value and you can make a ton of money off it, if you want to live your life that way, then fine. But scalpers can't sell if the community doesn't buy. And that, I think, gives us a tremendous amount of power, a tremendous amount of control over the aftermarket. If we put our foot down and say, no, I will not pay $120 for the Amazon exclusive Emperor Palpatine. I won't pay it. I will, buy the archive re-release and I'll 3D print a throne before I pay $120 for that figure. And really, a lot of the time there are ways around it. The San Diego Comic-Con exclusive Jabba the Hutt is one of the most expensive figures out there, and it's one that I don't have. So I bought the individual release of Jabba. I got a 3D printed dais, I got a 3D printed armrest, I got a hookah from a 1983 vintage set, and I got a little 3D printed Salacious Crumb. That was my workaround for not dropping $300 on that exclusive set. I'm not a completionist, I really just want to see characters represented, and if I have to do a bit of tweaking to get that, I will. So I've talked a lot about different factors that you can look out for on how to predict which figures are going to be the ones that spike in value. Really, ultimately, there is no definitive, fail-proof way of looking at a release schedule and being able to point out which one is going to spike in value. But there are definitely factors that you can look at that can help guide your decision making as to which figures that you're going to pre-order, which figures that you're going to pick up at retail when you see them, and which ones you're going to hold off on. If it's a Lando, hold off. It's going to drop in price. I don't know why. They're great figures. I don't know why they're always the ones that are left on the shelves, but here we are. Asking yourself simple questions like, how many times have I seen this character before? How is this wave structured? Is it a regular release or is it an exclusive? What are people talking about in the fan base? Is this something that is going to generate a lot of desire when it's released? For instance, let's say tomorrow that Yakface appears on Instagram and says, it's happening. Arc Trooper 5s is coming to the Black Series. He's going to be a Walmart exclusive. Best of luck to all of you. What could you ascertain from that? Well, it's a Walmart exclusive, so the release is probably going to be mishandled. It's 5, so it's an incredibly popular character. There is a lot of desire for this figure. People have been asking for it for years. Best case scenario, the figure is going to release and the value is going to go up. Almost immediately, I would say. Hell, just look at Jesse. Jesse had an air of controversy surrounding him when he was released. People complaining about the helmet sculpt, people complaining about how he was being released as a Walmart exclusive. He went on sale for pre-order last week and is already on eBay for $75. That tells you something. It tells you that these factors mean something in these releases. This was a video that I really wanted to make because it feels incredibly relevant to all of us. We've all asked ourselves this question at some point or another, and I just wanted to throw in my 10 cents as I say, one well-intentioned idiot who hasn't had any education in this field, isn't an economist, anything like that. I've been in the game for a while and I feel like I've seen these patterns and I wanted to share them. With all of that said, let me pass this subject off to you. What have you seen? What's your experience in the aftermarket? What are some factors that you've noticed that play into where a figure lands on the value scale once it leaves shops? And let's be a little bit honest with each other. Let's really open up. What is one figure in your collection that you know you overpaid for? You know you have one. We all have one. What is it? What's that one figure that you overpaid for? Until next time, I've been Grand Moff Tony. You may subscribe when ready. I just put my hand in front of my face. Get a soft, warm prediction on what's... Cut that out. It sounds like I said soft, warm dick.